Chapter 13. From Material to Intellectual Ownership. 1. The Emergence of Privilege in the Renaissance. As the physical earth was being carved into private estates by the gentry, a new, more ethereal form of enclosure began to manifest in the intellectual centers of Europe. During the Renaissance, the concept of privilege, privilegium, emerged as the embryonic ancestor of what we now call intellectual property. However, to the Renaissance mind, this wasn't a natural right inherent to a creator. It was a vertical act of grace bestowed by a monarch, a pope, or a city-state upon a specific individual or guild. It was, in the truest sense, a private law granted to a single person at the expense of the collective. The emergence of privilege represented a radical departure from the medieval commons of knowledge. In the centuries prior, a craft secret was guarded by a guild, and a story was part of a shared oral or manuscript tradition. Knowledge was like the air. It could be used by anyone who had the skill to grasp it. But the Renaissance state, obsessed with mercantilism and the accumulation of competitive advantages, began to view ideas as strategic assets. The privilege became the mechanism to privatize the light of reason. Imagine a 15th century workshop in Florence or Venice. A master artisan discovers a way to temper steel that makes it twice as strong as his neighbor's. In an earlier age, he might simply keep it a secret. Now, the state intervenes. By granting a privilege, the government offers him a deal. Reveal your secret to us, and we will grant you a legal fence. For the next 20 years, anyone else in this city who uses your method will be imprisoned, their tools confiscated, and their workshops razed. This wasn't about rewarding genius, it was about economic warfare. The privilege was a wall built around a process to ensure that one merchant or city-state could dominate a market, turning a common method into a private monopoly. The language of these early documents is chillingly possessive. They speak of the sole and exclusive right to exercise, practice, and employ a particular thought or craft. In this landscape, the privilege was a fleeting, fragile thing. It lasted only as long as the sovereign's favor. It wasn't a recognition of the author's soul or the inventor's genius, but a cold calculation of state utility. The Renaissance state sought to commercialize the very act of thinking, turning revelations and inventions into exclusive commodities that could be taxed, licensed, and policed. Furthermore, these privileges were the primary tools used to poach talent. A prince would offer a privilege to a foreign master weaver to entice him to leave his home and set up a factory in a new territory. Thus, the privilege became the currency of intellectual colonization. It ensured that the great theft moved from the tangible fields to the intangible mind. The intellectual world began to mirror the physical world, a series of private islands of knowledge floating in a sea of increasingly restricted common heritage. The fence was no longer of wood and wire. It was made of ink, parchment, and the threat of the king's sword. 2. The transition from industrial patents to printing privileges. The shift from fencing in industrial processes to fencing in the written word was catalyzed by the deafening, rhythmic clatter of the printing press. Before the mid-15th century, the right of the mind was largely a spiritual or academic concern. However, with the arrival of Gutenberg's revolution, the state and the merchant classes realized that information itself had become a mass-produced physical commodity. It was no longer enough to own a salt mine or a textile mill. One had to own the template of thought. Initially, patents, derived from literae patentes, or open letters, were strictly utilitarian. They were granted for the tangible miracles of the age. A more efficient water pump for the silver mines of the Tyrol, a new method for smelting iron, a secret formula for dyeing silk. But as the printing press began to flood the streets of Europe with affordable books, the legal machinery of the industrial monopoly was seamlessly grafted onto the world of literature. This transition was born of a cold, mercantile necessity. The early printers weren't romantic lovers of wisdom. They were high-stakes venture capitalists. To print a single edition of the Bible or a classic Latin grammar required a staggering investment. In hand-cut metal type, high-quality rag paper, months of labor. A printer who spent his fortune producing a book lived in constant fear. The moment the first copy hit the market, a rival with a faster press and lower standards could simply pirate the text, bypassing the initial costs and underselling the original creator. Thus, the first printing privileges were created. They weren't designed to protect the author's rights. In fact, the author was often a ghost in these negotiations, paid a pittance and then discarded. Instead, these privileges were factory protections. The state granted a printer a monopoly of the press for a specific title or even an entire genre. For example, a printer in London might be granted the exclusive privilege to print all law books, or a printer in Paris might hold the monopoly on all prayer books. The enclosure of the page mirrored the enclosure of the field. Just as a landlord fenced in the commons to ensure he alone could harvest the grass, the printer monopolist used the state seal to fence in the alphabet. This marked the final stage where the great theft moved from the tangible world to the intangible. The law no longer cared if you owned the physical book. It cared who owned the right to replicate it. The mine's output was now a protected industrial product, and the alphabet itself was being subdivided into private parcels of profit. 3. The goddess of justice asleep. Early piracies. In the early decades of the printing revolution, the goddess of justice was not merely blindfolded, she was fast asleep. Her scales gathering dust, while a chaotic, lawless frontier defined the world of ideas. This was the era of the great literary highwaymen. Because a royal privilege or a city-state's monopoly held no power beyond its own narrow borders, the 15th and 16th centuries became a golden age for intellectual piracy. In this landscape, the world of the press resembled a battlefield of shadows, where a book was treated as a prize of war rather than a sacred piece of property. Imagine the bustling docks of Venice or the hidden workshops of Basel. A printer might spend his life savings to produce a beautifully bound edition of a Greek classic. Yet before the ink was even dry on the last page, a literary pirate, an opportunistic printer from a rival city, would obtain a single copy. Within days, this pirate would have his own presses running at midnight, stripping away the expensive margins and fine paper of the original to produce a cheap, portable knockoff. These pirates were the ghosts of the industry. They paid no royalties to authors, no fees to the church, no taxes to the state. They operated in the gaps of a fragmented legal system, turning the enclosure of the page into a sieve. This rampant piracy created a profound and fascinating paradox. To the privileged printers, the early monopolists, this was a catastrophic theft that threatened the very survival of their trade. They viewed these unauthorized copies as a parasitic infestation. However, for the progress of human civilization, this lawlessness was a hidden blessing. Because the goddess of justice slept, ideas were able to travel with a velocity that no king or pope could control. If a radical scientific treatise was banned and burned in Paris, a pirate printer in the Netherlands would have a cheap, clandestine edition on the streets of London and Frankfurt within the month. The lack of a unified intellectual property law meant that information was effectively a wild animal, impossible to cage. The pirates of this era were, ironically, the most efficient distributors of the Renaissance and the Reformation. They cared nothing for the purity of the text or the honor of the author. They cared only for the market. But in their greed, they democratized knowledge. They turned the luxury items of the elite into the pocketbooks of the emerging middle class. This explores that gritty, ink-stained reality where the struggle for ownership wasn't fought in quiet courtrooms, but in the smuggling routes of the Rhine and the cutthroat competition of the book fairs. It was a time when the great theft of property was met with the great piracy of ideas, proving that before the law could truly fence in the human mind, the mind had already found 1,000 ways to leap over the walls. 4. Renaissance letter patents and technological monopolies. While the printers were fighting over the control of the alphabet, a parallel enclosure was occurring in the realm of engineering and physical invention. This was the era of the letters patent, literae patentes, literally open letters issued by a sovereign, bearing a prominent seal, so that all who saw them would know the bearer held a royal monopoly. Unlike the secretive guild secret of the Middle Ages, these patents represented the state's attempt to institutionalize and commercialize the light of invention. The most famous early example of this technological fencing occurred in 1421, when the Republic of Florence granted a patent to the architect Filippo Brunelleschi. He had invented a specialized barge with hoisting gear, the barellone, to transport massive marble slabs for the construction of the Duomo. Brunelleschi, ever the shrewd strategist, refused to use his invention unless the state guaranteed that no one else could copy it. He didn't just want a reward, he wanted a territorial monopoly over the idea. This was a revolutionary moment in the history of property. For the first time, the method became a commodity. A patent was essentially a deal struck with a state. The inventor revealed their secret to the public, and in exchange, the state provided an armed fence around that secret for a term of years. These technological monopolies were used as bait in the war for talent between European city-states. If a master glassmaker from Murano or a silk spinner from Lucca brought their secret to a new king, they were rewarded with a patent that criminalized any local competition. However, these early patents weren't about fostering innovation for the sake of humanity. They were about state power. A patent was a secret of the kingdom converted into a private profit. It allowed the state to decide who could work and how they could work. In this landscape, the artisan became a licensee of the crown. The genius of the individual was no longer a gift to the community, but a specialized piece of property that could be traded, sold, and enforced by the king's bailiffs. The enclosure of the mind had finally found its legal blueprint in the wax-sealed parchment of the patent. 5. The world of the press as an unregulated industry. Before the arrival of the modern Copyright Act, the world of the press was a raw, muscular, and largely unregulated industry. It was a trade governed not by abstract principles of authors' rights, but by the brutal logic of the stationers' guilds and publishing cartels. In this environment, the editor, or the master printer, was the absolute sovereign of the page, and the author was often a mere ghost haunting the machine, a source of raw material to be bought, processed, and forgotten. In the 16th and early 17th centuries, the business of books was a high-volume factory system. A printer would buy a manuscript from an author for a one-time flat fee, a few coins for a play, a handful of gold for a treatise. Once that transaction was complete, the author's legal connection to the work was severed forever. There were no royalties, no resale rights, no protection against the printer changing the title, cutting the text, or putting someone else's name on the cover to increase sales. The property in this industry was the physical stationer's right. In London, the Stationers' Company held a royal charter that allowed them to regulate their own trade. If a printer registered a book in the Stationers' Register, that book became the copy, hence copyright, of that specific printer. It was a perpetual monopoly granted to the member of the guild, not to the creator of the words. This system was designed to prevent inter-guild warfare and to act as a mechanism for state censorship. By ensuring that only certain licensed printers could own the right to print, the state could easily find and crush any seditious or heretical voices. The press was a machine of enclosure by license. It turned the author into a laborer and the book into a manufactured good. This strips away the romantic image of the Renaissance poet to reveal the gritty, ink-stained reality of the print shop, a place where the right to think was owned by the man who owned the press, and the great theft had successfully transformed the shared wisdom of ages into a tightly controlled guild monopoly.